Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about conformity. And this is a really interesting topic because I know a lot of us don't like to think that that we're conformists. We all like to think we're non-conformist, and certainly that's a part of the viewpoint of the United States, of people from the United States, is that we're independent, we're nonconformist, we, think for ourselves. And yet, social psychology tells us that we don't actually think for ourselves all the time, that many of us are sheep and we are conformists. So I loved this picture. So what's the difference between what we call compliance and conformity? So we talked a little bit about social roles and social norms, and we kind of go along with the program with a lot of that stuff, and that's compliance, where we change our behavior at the request of somebody else, but they don't have any particular authority over us. But, somebody tells us to line up at the Apple store here. With that, we do it because we know that that's what we're supposed to do. That's a social norm. People do line up and wait their turn for different things. So that's compliance. We go along, but because not because somebody has an authority over us, but because that's what we're supposed to do, and that's a social expectation, basically. Conformity is where we actually change our behavior, our attitudes, even our beliefs and opinions about things in order to match those of other people in our group. So we're trying to appease the people in our group, and we're conforming to those people's viewpoints. As human beings, we're actually really driven to fit in, which sounds terrible. So even people who seem to think they're nonconformist are actually conforming to that nonconformist group. So we're driven to fit in. We want to connect with other people, and that's not always bad. So conformity and compliance is not always bad. If everybody chose not to conform, not to comply, not to go along with social norms and rules, it could make day-to-day life pretty difficult. People refuse to line up at the movies. People refuse to act a certain way at the bank and things like that. It could cause complications and difficulties. So there's certain situations where it's important to comply and it's important to conform. So one of the famous psychologists, and one of the famous studies in psychology, was Solomon Asch's classic line experiment that was done in 1955. And what he really was measuring was how much will people conform when clearly the group is giving the wrong answer. So what he did was he showed everybody the standard line, and then he asked them to tell them which line, number 1, 2, or 3, was the correct line that matched that standard line. And of course, the answer is number 2, right? But what he did was he got a group of Confederates, so 5 people, that would say that it was line number 1 or line number 3 that was the right answer. And what do you think happened with the person that came in, the volunteer that comes into the experiment, and he's the last person, he or she is the last person to give their answer, and everybody in the group has picked line number 3. Is this person going to pick what they think is the right line, or are they going to go along with the group? And what do you think he found? So there was only one person that was the volunteer, and the others were actors, and they chose the wrong line intentionally. So 37% of the subjects actually conformed to the group's answer, even though it was obviously wrong. But they figured maybe there's something I don't know, right? So, okay, yeah, and why is it that people actually conform? So Ash found that people really do conform. And why is it that people conform? So we want to be part of a group, and we respect and admire that group. So here's a bunch of fraternity boys running around in their underwear. We want the approval of other people. So we're willing to conform to their viewpoints and go along with what they're doing. We also want to behave correctly, and this is often called what we call social proof, but we look to other people as to how to behave in a certain situation, especially if it's a situation that we're unfamiliar with, that's new to us. We're going to look to other people as to what's appropriate behavior in that situation, and then we're going to conform our behavior to that situation because we don't want to stand out. We don't want to look ridiculous, right? We want to behave correctly, so we do tend to conform to what everybody else is doing. And not everybody, granted, not everybody cares what other people think. And in some ways, that's really good. I think some of us care too much about what other people think, and that you have to have a balance in that. But a lot of times when you're in an unfamiliar new situation, we kind of tend to look to other people for what should we do in this situation. What kind of conditions increase the likelihood that people will conform? Well, if you have to report your decision in front of the other people and give your reasons, then you're going to be less likely. You're going to be more likely to conform to whatever the other group members said. So in the Solomon Asch experiment, you're going to be much more likely to go along with the group because then you won't have to explain your answer because it's going along with them. If you're unsure of the situation or your ability to perform the task. So, here you are in this line experiment and you're thinking it's obvious which is right, but everybody else has picked the wrong one, might make you unsure of whether or not you got the instructions correct or whatever. And if everybody is unanimous, so if in that Solomon Asch study and all 5 of the other participants picked the same line that was the wrong line. Now, if they had picked randomly and picked all different lines, then you might be more likely to actually give the answer that you think is right. But if they're unanimous, if they all agree that it's line number 2, no, it's line number 3, I think 2 was the right one. If they all agreed that it was line number 3, you're more likely to question yourself and just go along with the group that's unanimous. You're less likely to conform if one other person is going against the group. So if there were 4 people in that group that chose the wrong line, but there was one that chose that line too, and you could go after that person, you'd probably join that person and go against the group. So if you had somebody else that thought the same way you did, you'd be less likely to conform. So certainly when we in America, we're much more individualistic in our culture. We're much more me-centered, individual-centered, and we're less likely to conform than people from a different culture. So there are many cultures that are what we call collectivists, where they are more concerned about other people and less concerned about independence and self-reliance, but they're really concerned about others and being part of that culture. If you think about Asian cultures, they're much more collectivistic than we are. We're much more individualistic. So they would be much more likely to conform to the group than somebody from a individualistic society. So I put this in here, and this is talking about the power of persuasion and how people can be persuaded. I put this book up here. This is actually written by a professor, Robert Cialdini, at U of A, University of Arizona, and he's a very famous psychologist, and he goes into many of the persuasion techniques that salesmen use. And what he did, which was really fascinating, is he took some of his graduate students and had them apply for jobs in the insurance industry, in the car sales industry, in the sales industry, basically. And so they infiltrated these companies. They worked for these companies. I don't know if they had like fake resumes or whatever they had, but they went to all their trainings about how to sell their product to customers, how to persuade people to buy their product. And so he came up with all of these different persuasion and influence techniques that people use in the sales industry. And it's pretty fascinating. And many of them will be really familiar to you, but I'm not going to go into all of them. But persuasion is where we intentionally try to make somebody change their attitudes and beliefs. Many salesmen use different techniques to persuade us. The book talks about the foot in the door technique. Which is not the most exciting technique. A lot of times, one of the techniques is reciprocity, where they give you a gift, they give you something. You go into the car dealership, they got free coffee, free soda, free popcorn. They're giving you something, so now you owe something back. And most of us as human beings, if somebody gives us something, we feel indebted to that person, and so we feel like we want to give back to that person. And that's not a bad thing, but it can be used against us. The Hare Krishna used like flowers. They gave people flowers, asked for a donation, and a lot of times people felt obligated to give a donation because they gave him a nice flower. So there are many different persuasion techniques. If you're really interested in it, I highly recommend this book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. I think it is used in many business classes and sales type classes because it really is very accurate on the psychology of persuasion. So that is it on this chapter or this video about conformity and persuasion.